Hello.
Hello.
To begin with, could you say your name?
Okay. My name is Milana Ward, but my traditional Laotian name is Tanam Kwan, and I don't go by Tanam Kwan just because it was too long and complicated to write out, and my parents decided it was better to use a shortened middle name instead, so that I go by Milana. Okay.
And if you could take us back to 1975, before the end of the war,
Mm-hmm.
maybe March, April, could you describe for us your life at that time?
1975, I would have been about 2 years old, so I don't remember much. But what my parents have conveyed to me was that we were living in Vientiane, which is the capital city. I was born there, so they were working as a pharmacist and a nurse. My dad was working for the army hospital as a pharmacist, and my mother was a nurse at the local general hospital. See, I need these notes for that reason. And life was, as it was. My parents, I guess, would be considered educated. I don't know if we were be considered upper class or anything. I think it's just middle class people working. And then it was around 19, I think around that time that, like sort of the Communist Party and all the political situation happened. I don't obviously understand the extent of it back then at that age, but there was a lot of people that were like from the old regime, what my mom would define it as, that were nervous about how that would impact their life. Like the Communist Party being whatever political perspectives and policies they hold. So my parents, because they were in the helping field, they worked with a lot of different people in their capacity, and so they've helped a lot of people. So what ended up happening was when people were starting to be shipped off to re-education camp, especially the people that were educated at that time. There was somebody who belonged to the Communist Party that were friends of my parents they have helped, and basically gave them a heads up that you're like my dad's name was on a list to be sent away, and from my understanding that if you are sent away to these camps, you don't come back. We don't know what happens to these people, so they were told that you need to get your family out, and that's kind of what prompted them to leave, was the warning from this person. They didn't tell anybody, not their family, that their intention was to leave. It was literally like in the middle of the night, just kind of packing. Like they left everything pretty much behind. They didn't take any photos. They didn't want to be caught with anything. So they just sort of gathered, like my sister and I, up and kind of went to Savannah Kit province, where my grandparents lived, and to sort of make the move to go to Thailand. So that's kind of how it happened, from their story.
So they had already had intention to leave the country right at.
Just maybe not initially, because I think a lot of people, when all of that change was happening, was still really confused about how that was going to play out. So many people stayed. A lot of people stayed and never left. But there were some people that were fearful of, for what was going to happen to them, because apparently, from my understanding, the royal family were executed, or something happened to them where they were diminished. So a lot of the people that were educated, especially from my understanding, were fearful that they were going to be sort of eradicated, right? From just so that it seemed like they wanted to educate the people that were the common people, I guess, in that sense.
And was your father targeted because of his involvement with the army, the army hospital?
No, just because I think from what they have told me, it was just because they were educated. I think anyone who was educated were considered a threat. For whatever reason, like maybe because they were maybe considered more strong-minded, or I don't know. I mean, it's a generalization, but it's probably what some people thought. So whatever process was put in place to, sort of get rid of those individuals was taking place. But yeah, so that's really what prompted them. Like it wasn't, they never sort of had these thoughts like to begin with. I think it was just a fear and And yeah, knowing that people who did get sent to these camps never came back, so we didn't really want to chance that, right? Because if that happened to my father, then my mother might have been next, and then what would happen to us? We don't know. So it was really from sort of that situation that they decided to make the move.
And the village where your grandparents lived, that was quite a ways south.
Yeah, like when you look on the
Vientiane.
map, you can see where it is in proximity to the city. So I don't know exactly in terms of how long the travel time was, but you know, you can probably check that. But I don't remember the trek going there. I just remember us I don't even remember us leaving. I was just remembering us having to leave, and then somehow I remember us arriving to my grandparents' home. And it seemed like it was just a visit, like that's how they presented it, like we're just gonna go visit the grandparents, so it wasn't anything unusual. And I just remember when we got there, I don't know how long after that, my dad kind of crossed the Mekong River in a small boat a week before us. So my sister, myself, and my mother stayed behind, and I didn't understand at that time because I was wondering why my dad had to go, because you know, like why can't we go with him?
The town where was it the town where your grandparents lived?
Like it's the province, so I don't know too much about it. I would imagine it's just a small town, but you know,
And it's right next to the river. It's right next to the Mekong River.
I believe so. If you look on the map, it probably is close, because I just remember my grandfather, after my dad had left, like I do remember my mom looking really, really worried and stressed when she was saying goodbye to him, and I didn't understand, you know, at that time what was going on. So, but yeah, so after a week later, we didn't hear from my dad, so we didn't think anything of it. And then it was time for my sister and I and my mom to cross. My grandfather...
and crossing the river meant crossing the border.
Yes, which was illegal, and you're defecting essentially, and you'll get shot on the spot if you do. I mean, that's what people say, and that's what has happened apparently. And they decided to cross in broad daylight, which is unheard of, because you know people just don't do that. You get caught and you die. So, but they dressed up as fishermen, and my grandfather had hired some kind of guardsmen, like gunmen, like just that he knew, that trusted, just to help cross over. So I think it was one other one, maybe two, I can't remember, that dressed up as fishermen as well. And I remember just my mother putting us in the boat. It was just like a small fishing boat, and covering us up with, she said it was like banana leaves, but I remember it being blankets, just so that we weren't visible. And they crossed, and I remember my experience was like just peeking behind the covers and seeing the water and wanting to touch it, and sticking out my hand, and my mom pushing my hand back in, because you know you're a kid, right? So you're like, oh, this is fun. So
how wide is the river at that crossing?
I don't know. Like I don't know. It probably felt like forever for my mom, who was crossing, but for me it felt like a short ride, because when we got to the other side, my dad and some friends were already waiting there for us, and there was this sense of like relief and happiness that I was just glad to see my dad, but I didn't understand the scope of what that meant, that we were over there for that moment, safe at that time, but not always, not out of safety yet, right, or out of danger yet. So yeah, and then I don't know how long shortly after we arrived, like across that, we went to the refugee camp, but that's where we ended up after that.
Did your family have to walk through the jungle to get to a refugee camp?
I don't remember walking, but we probably did, because I can't imagine us like having any other vehicle to get there. But that's something I could probably check on the facts, but they didn't really talk about that piece of it, so I should have asked. But yeah, I don't think they went into detail by detail about how we got to that spot. They just kind of gave us the general overview of how we ended up where, right, in that sense. So.
And did they describe for you the refugee camp?
I remember some of it. It was crowded. That's what I remember. It was really noisy, and it was huts kind of set up, and it just felt like a fun place to be, because there was kids running around. As like a 5-6 year old, you just see, like, you don't understand what's going on. You just see a bunch of people in one spot, and it looked like a big party to me. Something, you know, that's what it felt like. It's sort of like a bunch of people celebrating. My mother and father, when they were there, my dad spoke fluent French, so he volunteered in, I think, with the Doctors Without Borders there. And then my mother volunteered with as like with UNICEF, in the camp, is what she said. And then one day, ambassador from Canada arrived to the camp, and he was French speaking, and my dad was used as an interpreter for him, and because he was, I guess, interviewing people to come to Canada, so he was processing people from the camps. And after spending a day with him, my dad had asked him at the end of it to say, if you can help expedite my family's move to Canada, if you can help us with that. And that's what happened, is the ambassador sort of got that rolling and got us out of there sooner than later. A lot of people, a lot of families had been there for even 5 years waiting to leave, and it was really a lengthy process for many people. But because my dad had the chance to connect with someone of capacity, they were able to, with their connections, get us out sooner. And so we were only in the camp for 6 months approximately, and which is by any definition was a very short time. And so that's kind of how that process happened. So the gentleman expedited the process and helped us get all the paperwork and everything to get to Canada sooner than later.
And what year was this?
It was 1980. It was around, I think, April or something, or October or something, that happened. And then we arrived in Canada in November.
Before we continue, so this is 5 years after the end of the war. Do you remember how long your family lived in Vientiane for?
5 years. We didn't make the move until like 1980, literally. Like, I think in April was when we left Laos, or around that. I think I'll just check my. Yeah, April 1980 is when we fled the country. Yeah.
Okay. So please continue. Oh, and before you continue, how long did it take other people to be accepted, to get be resettled out of the refugee camp at that time?
Well, like I said, there were some people that had been there for 5 years and were still waiting to be accepted somewhere. And there's some people that hadn't been there a couple years, and some people that just arrived. So it was a longer waiting period for a lot of people than sooner. I guess it just depends on which country would open up for them, from my understanding. I don't think people, like, a lot of, I think, from what I heard stories, is that a lot of Laotian people wanted to go to a hot country. But Canada was the one that was more available at that time, so you can't be choosy. So if Canada was coming knocking, then you go wherever there's an opening, right? From my understanding, you don't get to be selective of which country you get to go to as a refugee. You're just lucky to be able to be accepted anywhere, really. So, yeah.
Okay, please continue.
Okay, so we came to Canada, and we had arrived in Montreal, and I think we spent a few days there being processed. And then we were flown to Edmonton and arrived in Edmonton in November.
How was it chosen? How was it decided that you would be settling in Edmonton?
I don't actually know. I guess whatever city, I mean, I'm sure they have a process in place through their, you'll have to sort of ask the resettlement people that. I don't know how we didn't pick Edmonton. Like, we didn't know anything about Canada, really. So it wasn't like, oh, you know what, we have people we know in Edmonton. It was just like, that's what came up, and that's where we went. And it's probably because there were sponsorship people that were maybe available in the area, and that's probably why, because you can't just go anywhere. You have to make sure there's the support systems in place in those cities, right? And maybe Edmonton had more of them, because there's a lot of people that settled in Edmonton around that time. So I would imagine that would be probably one of the main reasons. So yeah, and then they lived in Spruce Grove, so we didn't even stay in Edmonton initially. We got taken to Spruce Grove, where we lived with them for,
Your sponsors.
yeah, our sponsors. So yeah.
And tell me about your sponsors.
I don't remember them too well, but I just remember them being really nice and kind. They seemed kind, and my parents described them as being kind.
Was it a church group?
Well, it's church family, so I think they belong to a church organization, and they probably sign up, enlisted to be one of the supporting families. And their family, I think they had 2 children. I think they had a daughter and a son, if I remember correctly, and they just seemed like nice, and we stayed with them for, I don't remember exactly how long we stayed with them. I would imagine maybe only for a few months, because we did get set up in our own apartment in Spruce Grove, because I did some kindergarten in Spruce Grove, so I remember that part. So I think we probably had stayed in Spruce Grove for about maybe 6 months to 8 months in total before we moved to Edmonton. My parents described them as being nice people, and that's how I remember them, because I was young, so I don't think I could really say anything else about it. They helped us, with getting around, navigating Canada or like the city, and just things, shopping and all the things that you take for granted, when you do things, right? My first impression of Canada, I do remember that, was because I felt I was really sick arriving in Canada. I wasn't eating. I was just I just felt I was really skinny. I was not well. So I just remember feeling like I wanted to vomit when I got off the plane. But just seeing snow in November, right? And that was a novelty of seeing snow on the ground. Not so much anymore. But at that time, as a child, you just thought it was the most amazing experience, right? Like, who gets to see snow, right? So that's what I do remember, is that it was cold, and I just liked the snow. So yeah.
And so your parents were brought over under government sponsorship or under the sponsorship of this group?
Both, because the government assisted, right, in the processing, that it had to go to a government system regardless. You can't just skip that part of it. And then I think through partnership probably with I would imagine the church group, like working with a government organization. I think it was probably a collaboration of that, from my understanding. So, yeah.
And what kind of help did your parents receive from this sponsorship group?
I think, just the basic things, like we were supported in helping set up with our own apartment, purchasing furniture and things like that. So I would imagine, because I don't imagine my parents brought a lot of money with them. So I think that, financially the government helped with that, and I don't know to what extent the sponsorship family received to help us, but I think that there was some probably government funneling the money through them to help us get set up financially. So. And
did they get ESL training?
I think I do remember this, yes, because I think they had gone to some kind of English as a second language class in the evening, and they didn't have a babysitter. So I remember just being in the other class. I was empty and just kind of killing time, running around the classroom where I think it was my mother that was taking an evening class. The instructor was very kind, because I was, I think, noisy in the other room, and my mom had to come, and I remember her telling me to quiet down, where there was people trying to learn in the other room.
Was you and your sister?
I think it was me and my sister. My sister is a more quiet person than I am.
She older or younger?
She's older by about 2 years. Yeah, so I think she was just kind of sitting like a good person that she is, and I was just the brat in the family, so I kind of was bored, so I was trying to kill time, but it was good. So so they did take some, for sure. Definitely my mother, probably my father as well, I think. So.
What kind of work did they find?
So they, I think they worked in my dad couldn't work as a pharmacist, or my mom as a nurse anymore, as many people know that when you come from a country and you have your degree and everything already, it doesn't necessarily are the same equivalency in Canada. So if you were to do the same career here, you would have to go back and get your education again. And when you're coming here with a family, and you're in your 30s already, it's not something that you want to take on. Not everyone can do that. Some people do and get their degree again, but it's not something my parents had time for or capacity to do. So they'd never practice in their original field anymore. But they work with one of the things I remember my dad working for a pharmacist, probably just helping, but not as a pharmacist, and their family, because they were really nice. And I don't know how long that happened for. But really, they just, like my mom and dad have done odd jobs being in Canada, like they've done cleaning, delivering newspaper. You're never too proud to do the things that you have to do, right, to support your family. It doesn't matter what you did back home. So they've told me they've done sort of any job really to sort of support us. Eventually, my dad got a job at Northwest Drug Company in Edmonton, just kind of working in the mezzanine, like not as a pharmacist, but so that's what prompted us to move to Edmonton, and my mom got a position like in a nursing home, probably as just like an aide or somebody to just help in the nursing home. So that's sort of what got us to Edmonton eventually, is them getting work in the city. And yeah, so we moved to the city, and from there we moved to inner city Edmonton, because every refugee seems like they live downtown Edmonton when you first get settled in the community, because it's affordable, and that's kind of where a lot of Asian people are. So that's kind of where we ended up.
So this was about a year after you arrived in
Yeah,
school?
I would say so, because we arrived in November, and so I did some kindergarten in Swiss Grove, but I started grade 1 in Edmonton. So yeah, I would say 6 to 8 months of arriving into Canada, we got to Edmonton, and I remember starting grade 1 in St. Catherine's School here in Edmonton, which is like, not too far from here. So,
do your parents talk about the obstacles that they faced at that time?
They do here and there as we got older, but not necessarily like when we were younger, sitting us down. I think it was really painful for them to talk about everything. So a lot of times they just don't, right? But every so often they'll talk about it if it comes up in conversation, or if it kind of leads to that in some capacity. But it's not something that they sort of make a point to go, okay, we want to tell your story. I think this is kind of the reason why I made the effort to come here for this interview, just because it was probably one of the few times that we would have an opportunity to even share some of our stories, because no one really asks, to be honest. Like, you tell your friends and you tell people that you know along the way when you're here, but nobody really formally asks you to really talk about it. So, yeah.
Do you talk to your parents about it for this interview?
I had to, because I was so young when I arrived, so all the information that I have is just sort of based on very limited memory, right? Because I grew up most of my life in Canada from 6 and on. But so the story had to really come from them. So when I was asked to be part of this, I got the questions and I sat them down and I said, please have a look at this and tell me what your thoughts are, and if you can sort of walk me through the process. So she wrote me notes, because she didn't want me to get it wrong. So she just kind of wrote everything out in 2.5 pages and said, take this with you. I'm like, okay, I will. So I kind of reviewed it and said, I'll sort of retell it in my own way. I won't read it word for word, Mom, because it still has to be from my words. But yes, so yeah, they're not, they're very introverted people in general. So it's not within their personality to be kind of talking about it anyways. I think Asian people in general tend to be a little more private, I think, from what I found.
But and was that one of your first times talking to them about it?
No, I've talked to them about it like here and there over my lifetime, and with my sister too. My sister, who is only a couple years older than me, actually has a really good recollection of details, like things that I'm like, wow, that happened? She's like, it did happen. And then I would check with my parents and they're like, yeah, that happened. I'm like, how do you remember that? And you're only 2 years older than me. But it's amazing how we all retain things differently in our recollection of things. But yes, we do talk about it. But I think I've had more conversations with my sister about my parents' experience, because I think that, like, sometimes I do feel like when I ask my mom questions or my dad, it's hard for them to sort of relive it, so they don't want to sort of talk about it too much in details. Like, I mean, they'll share things, and if I probe a little bit more, they'll answer it, but it's not something that they sort of make a plan to sort of, okay, we're gonna tell you our story now, listen up, you know.
But why do you think it's difficult for them to?
Well, it's just because, you know, they had to leave their life there, and they had a life, they had a career, they had like family. We have a huge my aunties and uncles are still there, friends, like, you know, all that had to be left behind. And there's also, I am sure, a sense of guilt that they left and they didn't stay behind to endure whatever everyone had to live with, because the people, like, we went back to Laos about 6 years ago with my parents and my like, you know, my son, the oldest one was in middle school at that time, and my other one was in elementary. And it was hard for them because some people, they sort of cut ties with friends after they left, because they told me that they didn't tell the family because some of them worked, you know, for kind of worked in the government, and so they didn't want to put them in a position to have to answer where we were or lie about us or anything like that. So that is the reason why they didn't tell anyone, so that they would not be put in a position of the danger themselves to have to be interrogated or anything of that nature, about where we were and what happened to us. So literally most people didn't know what happened to us even till we came back to Laos to visit at that time. Some people thought that my parents were dead, and they didn't. Even when people thought it was safe to go back and visit and connect with people again, my parents just decided to not do that. So so when we did go back to Laos 6 years ago, and she reached out to some of her friends, it was bittersweet, because some of them were really upset and happy to hear that she was alive and so happy to see her, and then also angry with them for having not connected back sooner and letting them know that they were alive and safe and all that nice stuff. So it's, yeah, there's a lot of probably unresolved guilt that they still feel, I think, yeah, and that's probably why it's hard for them to bring it up, right? And because people who have stayed back, you know, and have gone through whatever political situation at that time, you know, face hardship too, but they stayed and they were resilient and they built successful lives, you know, to this day in Laos, staying in Laos. So like there's probably that sense about, well, you could have stayed, nothing bad would have happened, we were fine, you know.
So from what you understand, what were the obstacles and struggles that your parents faced when they were settling in and integrating into Canada?
Probably one of them, of course, like I think most newcomers, is the language, right? The cultural literacy of things. You know, having to try to find their place in a country that they have no connection to, and community that they don't know, because, you know, when you arrive, you don't automatically get an instant Laotian community here, or, you know, you have to sort of, and because they're introverts to begin with, they're not the kind of people that would be like, go out and just make an effort to meet people and so forth. So they kept to themselves, and really what I think sort of helped us transition a little bit better is the fact that we lived in inner city Edmonton, where all other refugees seems to be congregating to. So it sort of formed this refugee community in a certain area of Edmonton, and who had like shared experience. So that probably was a little bit comforting for them, more so than having to go like stay in a suburb where there wasn't any other people that had sort of the similar experience and understanding. Because I went, and I met a couple of the people like that you're going to be interviewing too here, or one of them in elementary, like we were refugee students together in elementary. So that's how I've known her. I've known her since then.
And
yeah.
And was it just Laotian refugees that you were
No.
forming bonds with, or
No,
refugees from other parts of the world?
You know, it's funny because it's not really Laotian people, like, because our Laotian community in Edmonton was actually not huge like the Vietnamese community. I think they might have connected with some people that they knew from the homeland that kind of came around the same time, and so that's probably how they sort of kept that connection. But for the most part, the refugees were from Vietnam and Cambodia and other parts. So a lot of my friends that I met were Vietnamese background, not Laotian at all. I think I met one Laotian student that came to our school, and they paired me with her because she didn't speak English that well, so they asked me to help her, and that's the only reason I remember her. But other than that, not much. Yeah.
But that helped you in your integration. Was the networks
Yes.
that formed with other refugees, with other
Yes,
new immigrants.
I think so, and I think it was more so for like my sister and I more than my parents, because like I said, my parents are kind of introverted people, so they if we did anything in the community, it was kind of few and far, and they would really only keep some close friends at heart. Like they weren't kind of like involved heavily in the activities of the Laotian community, from my recollection. I mean, we did some involvement because I remember in my elementary years, we took Laotian dancing lessons, and so the little Laotian dance troupe would sort of do these showcases around Edmonton, and we did one at Westminton Mall one time, and like that's kind of one of the pictures that you'll see in my when I sent was these a cultural showcase at different locations across the city, and that was through the community involvement at that time. But it sort of faded pretty much when I left elementary.
So what helped your parents in their integration into Canada?
I think once they found work in Edmonton, they just sort of worked hard, and just like everything, you pay your bills and you just take care of your family, and your kids go to school. In terms of the Laotian community, like my parents were involved to some aspects of it, but not heavily. I did some cultural Laotian dance lessons with the community, group, more in elementary age, but outside of that, I think after like middle school, I don't remember my sister and I being involved in the community much. My parents would just kind of, they would have a few close friends and contacts that they stay connected with, and they will probably go to the occasional community events, but in terms of like organizing things and stuff, I don't think they were wanting to be involved in that capacity so much. They did do some things, but it was kind of few and far from what I remember, because I think in our family, if they were so involved heavily, I would remember them being at events and me being at events, and that's kind of not how I remember my childhood. So.
And they stayed in those jobs for much of their careers?
Yes, like my dad and mom, like my mom got worked in a nursing home for a little bit, I don't know for how long, and then she eventually got a job where my dad was working, and so they actually worked there like over 30 years combined. Like the company has moved location and moved owners and all that stuff throughout the years, but it started but it's sort of the same company that sort of transitioned over the years. So they stayed with that company, and they got like the long-term service award, and when they retired a few years ago, they left with good pensions and all that nice stuff. So yes.
Sorry, is this still the pharmacy?
No, it's called Northwest Drug Company. So they're a pharmaceutical supply company. So they have been called different things over the years. But when my dad got the job, it was called Northwest Drug Company. And yeah, so and then it became like McKesson, I think, eventually, like was the last name that that company had before my parents retired. I think it became McKesson.
And what occupations, what kind of jobs did they do there?
They worked in the mezzanine area, I believe. I don't know in what capacity, but like not in any sort of like administrative office setting. Probably more like in the warehouse and the processing and all that stuff. So like I said, they never returned to their careers. That's sort of something they left behind when they left Laos, right?
So 40 years later, how do you feel about the life that you and your family have made here in Canada?
It's good. It's the only life I know. I don't really have anything to compare it to in terms of what life would have been like in Laos had my parents stayed, and what kind of person I would have become. I mean, the person I am is because they moved here, and with my sister as well. Like, you know, I speak English. You know, I'm a mom, and I have 2 teenage boys, and my husband is of like he's half indigenous and half Ukrainian. So, and I'm Laotian background, so my children are mixed. And, you know, obviously that was because we moved to Canada, that that's the life that sort of was made for me with that decision, right? I mean, I'm obviously happy about that decision because I don't think I would change anything there. But I mean, my regret for my parents is more of like they didn't have the career in life that they should have had for the rest of their life. I mean, I think that, you know, they work really hard. My dad came from a really big family. I think he's the oldest of like maybe 12 kids or something, from a farming kind of family, and he worked really hard to get to university and, you know, become a pharmacist. So, and my mom, you know, was a nurse, so they were both very driven people. And so to come to Canada, that's sort of like, maybe that's the sacrifice they made to bring us to safety, was just losing their career and their dreams and hopes for what they had for themselves. That makes me sad, but I understand why they did it, and it's a choice you make, and sometimes it is what it is, and you live with it, right? Some people don't transition well, and they struggle with that, and there's a lot of mental health issues involved, and we all struggle to that as a family as well with them. You know, I mean, it stressed them out too, to be somewhere there, and, you know, they don't know, right?
Do they still experience any kind of
post-traumatic?
Yeah, mental struggles with that?
I think they're more settled now in their old age. They're retired, and, you know, like, I mean, they've been here for so long now that it's sort of like they're happy, like, you know, to spend time with the kids and the family, and they don't have these giant expectations of what, you know, life needs to be like. I think they sort of settle into a comfortable spot in just sort of having, you know, my mom gardening and my dad just retiring, and so it's they're content, you know, like I don't think they don't want to go back and sort of revisit regrets and what could have been, should have been, and all that, because then you can really torture yourself doing that, right? So I think maybe throughout our life they might have struggled with that, but now it's sort of, they seem like more at peace for sure about it.
What can future generations of Canadians learn from your parents' experience and Canada's Southeast Asian refugee program?
I don't know necessarily about the program, what they can learn, but I think that, I think the takeaway that I would want people to understand is that, you know, people who are leaving their country under those kind of situations don't feel like they have a choice, even though they did, and they chose to go somewhere at that time for fear of their lives being, you know, in danger. So, you know, sometimes I see, like, even with the Syrian crisis, like, you know, there's a lot of racism, racial comments made about whatever, people making ignorant comments, and it's really sad to see, because all the people that are fleeing war-torn situations don't want to. Everyone wants to stay where they were born and where they have family and support system, and to be, in a sense, forced to leave because of what's going on is hard. And I think that a lot of people who don't understand that will make these very unkind comments about, oh, they should whatever, and that's, I think for me, just really any group that is marginalized, oppressed, you know, experience any kind of struggles and barriers. I think it would be good for, like, most of us to sort of take a breath and just learn to understand and really educate ourselves on the issues and that sort of are tied to why things happen and why things are happening. And a lot of us just make these kind of, especially now with social media, just make these sort of off comments without thinking about it. And it's hurtful and it's racist and it's not really helping to evolve into reconciliation of any sort. I mean, you see that with indigenous like communities. I mean, they've been, you know, oppressed for so long, and I mean, because my husband is indigenous, so I can speak a little bit about that. And but it's still going on. You know, you see all the stuff that's going on right now with the pipeline, and it's an ongoing thing. And you know, I had a conversation with a friend recently saying that, well, you know, I understand that people, you know, with the residential school and all that, it's hard to reconcile that, but people should really try to forgive the past and move on. And what I said to my friend was that I understand what you're saying. I understand that we have to forgive about what happened in the past and try to move on. But those issues are not in the past. It's still very present here, and that's why, for many people, it's easier said than done to just say forgive and forget. So that's just something that, I don't know, I think for me, seeing what's going on in sort of all communities, not just our refugee community, it would just be nice if everyone, it's a very idealistic endeavor, it seems like at this point, but just to show kindness to each other. So I told myself I wasn't going to get preachy, but I think I am, because that's really what I have to say about it, is just everyone just try to be understanding and kind. And I never really like the word tolerance, because it feels like you're putting up with something when you say you're tolerating. I think just to try to understand. You don't have to agree with everything, and I think I told my friend that we can have a conversation, but we won't always agree on the points, but that's okay too, as long as it's done in a mutually respectful way. We'll work towards reconciliation, but it's still a really, really long road ahead of us. So, yeah.
Thank you very much for sharing your story.
Yeah, no problem.
We appreciate it.